Hello, and welcome to our presentation, where I'm going to be talking you through the changes that are coming up to the VAT penalties for late submission and late payment of VAT. So this is a big change because HMRC have been using one system of penalties for as many years as I can remember, where every time you are late with submitting or paying a VAT return, it doesn't matter whether it's payment or submission of the tax return, every time you're late, they will charge you a penalty. And every time you're late, that penalty gets worse. Under the new rules, there will be two groups of penalties. There will be penalties for late submission and separate penalties for late payment. So what I'd like to do is I'm just going to explain to you what we're going to talk about. I'm going to take you through a worked example. The first worked example is going to be the penalties under the old set of rules so that you know how it would have worked then. Then we'll look at the new rules, and then we'll look at the difference so that you can see in practice how late tax returns are going to be penalised. So if you're ready, let's get started. The rules under the old system, as I said, do not change depending on whether you are late with submission or payment. So you could make your payment on time by the 7th of the month following when your tax return is due, but not submit the tax return, and you'd receive a penalty even though HMRC have got your money. Equally, you could submit the tax return on time and not make the payment, and you'd receive exactly the same penalty. The penalties that used to be charged, I'm going to draw it into Excel. Here we go. The way HMRC used to charge penalties up until the 31st of December 2022 is that the first late penalty, which they call defaults, you actually receive no surcharge. The second default, now this is in a 12-month period, you either get no surcharge if your turnover is less than 150,000, or if your turnover is greater than 150,000, you get a 2% surcharge. I'm going to focus on businesses where their turnover is greater than 150,000. The third default, you get a 5% surcharge. Fourth default, you get a 10%. The fifth, you get 15%, and 6 or more, you get 15%. So as you can see, every time you make an error in late payment or submission, you get a worse penalty than the time before. Now, I did the client story the other day, and in that client story, I was taking you guys through what would happen if you missed 3 tax returns in a row. Let's take that scenario again, and let's say for this business, under the old rules, let's say that you had your March 2022 quarter end, your June 22 quarter end, your September 22, and then December. let's say that the VAT due on each of those was £10,000. Let's say you haven't submitted any of those returns. Let's say all of these three are outstanding and overdue, and this one, because we're in the middle of December 22, is not yet due. Well, let's line up our penalties. Well, this first one, late payment or submission, will receive a penalty of 0 because it's the first late payment or submission, the first default. The second one, we're going to get a charge of 2%. The third one would be 5%. And if we're late with December, it'll be £1,000. You can see quickly this is getting worse and worse. Now, there's another rule that we need to take into account. I'm not going to dwell on it because it's one of the old rules, but it says that there's no surcharge if the amount is less than 400. And that means in this case, there will actually be 0 penalty. This will be 500. And that'd be 1,000. So if you have gone without submitting a tax return for the full year, the penalties that you would be charged under the current rules would be £1,500. So these are the penalties actual. Now that's quite straightforward actually in comparison to the penalties that will be charged under the new system. And the reason for that is because they are splitting the penalties for late payment and late submission. Let me start by taking you through what happens if you submit your return late. Well, every time you submit your return late, you're going to get a penalty point. And once you have 4 penalty points, if you do quarterly returns, you have to start paying a penalty surcharge of £200 for every return that's late. So the first one, second one, third one, there's no charge. When you hit 4 penalty points, you then have to pay £200 for every late return. To wipe the slate clean of penalty points, you need to get 12 months when nothing is late. If you do that, the penalty points reset to 0. So, late submission. And in this example, we've got our quarters again. I'm going to copy them from our other sheet. So, if it's submitted late, let's just put the deadlines in. This would be 2023 now with the new rules. Deadline for submitting this one will be the 7th of May 23, because it's a month and 7 days afterwards. So then we'd have 7th of July, August 23. We'd have the 7th of November 23 and the 7th of February 2024. If we don't submit any of these returns, we would get 1 point. We then have 2 points by this point. We have 3 points here. And 4 points here. So in this case, we would have no penalty, no penalty, no penalty. And then on the fourth one, once we have 4 penalty points, we'd receive a £200 penalty. That's for late submission. This is HMRC's way of saying, even if you can't pay us, still tell us how much tax you owe. So they've made the penalty for late submission much lower to encourage you to at least submit. even if you're not going to be in a position to pay. So now let's talk about payment. Let's say that all of these remain unpaid. Now, the penalties for late payment are more confusing. They've brought in many layers of penalties. I'm going to write them in here. The first penalty is charged 15 days after the return was due. So that would be the 22nd of May, 22nd of August, 22nd of November, and the 22nd of February 2024. The penalty that will be charged is a flat 2% of the VAT owed. We'll be doing that times that. So for each one that we miss, there will be a £200 penalty. We would then have, if it remains outstanding, at 30 days after the return was due, a further 2%. So that's the 7th of May plus 30 days, would be the 6th of June. And as you can see, these other dates as well. A further 2%. So that would be 200, 200, 200, and 200 in our scenario. Two. Up 3. The third penalty will be once the return is 31 days overdue. And this is charged at 4% pro rata. 4% for a whole year. So for the part of the year that it's outstanding, you'd be charged a 4% penalty. Now, in this case, I'm thinking let's change the scenario slightly. Let's pretend that it's the same year. Let's pretend we've got this 2022 year, but just with the new penalties. And let's only charge penalties if at today's date, which is the 16th of December, the deadline has passed. So for example, in this case, this return isn't due until the 7th of February 2023, so it's not yet overdue. So I'm not going to charge this penalty because it's not overdue yet. This is also not overdue, so I'm not going to charge this one. I'm not going to charge this one for the same reason. The reason we're doing this is so that we can now look at these prorated penalties. 16th of December 2022. So these penalties are calculated with reference to the day that it was due, i.e. in this case, the 7th of May for the first quarterly return. So we need to work out how many days overdue it is. Which is going to be today's date, 16th of December, minus the 7th of May. And this return is 223 days overdue. this one's 131 days, this one's 39 days overdue. So in each of those three scenarios, there will be a 31-day penalty, which is going to be 4% times 223 days divided by 365 to prorate the penalty times the amount of VAT. And you can see the 4% penalty that will be charged in each of these three cases. Again, there's no penalty here because it's not overdue. On top of that, they will charge you interest. And interest is due at base rate plus 2.5%. Now, I'm going to take base rate for this as 3%. And let's do a part 4. Part 4 is part 4 of the penalties for late payment. And this is going to be interest at 2.5% above base rate, which is prorated. So again, we need to know the number of days overdue. Let's just fix our formula because I didn't do my dollars very well. Here we go. So it's the same number of days overdue. But in this case, instead of 4%, it will be 2.5% plus base rate, which is 3%. Times the amount of VAT due. So we can finally calculate our total penalties due. We'll do total for late submission and then late payment. The late submission penalty, you notice, is 0. The late payment penalty is part 1, 15 days overdue, part 2, 30 days overdue, part 3 for 31 days or more overdue, and part 4, which is the interest charge. And then I'm going to sum those up. The final thing I'd like to add to this is a comparison of the penalties under the old rules and the penalties under the new rules. So this is new rules. And let's bring in our old rules. With our default surcharges from our other sheet. And I think you can see that the total penalties, although they're not too dissimilar, under the new system it would be 2,000, whereas in the old system it's 1,500. Look how the way they are charged has changed. Instead of this sliding scale of pain, which gets worse and worse as time goes by, we instead have a system where the first overdue return is going to cause the most pain because it's been overdue for the longest. Once that's paid off, the pain will stop on this return, and the next one and the next one will get worse until they're all paid off. So we have a system where if you pay early, even though you are overdue, you might end up with lower penalties than in the old system. If you ignore an overdue return for longer, it will hurt you more in the new system. I think that's my summary of the changes, really. This is a change which encourages you to submit your return, even if you don't know when you're going to be able to pay it. It is then a system that encourages you to pay earlier to avoid high penalties. And it does away with this sliding scale of pain. So just because you've had a bad quarter or even 2 bad quarters doesn't make your life even harder going into the next quarter. You're on a level playing field with every other company who is paying VAT. I think that that's quite a fair way of doing it personally, and these changes are changes that I can understand why they're doing them, and that I think will end with the results that they intended. So that's the penalties as they are as they're set out. There's a couple of scenarios that I'd like to talk you through though, where you'll be penalised slightly differently. So I'm going to load a new spreadsheet so that I can show you those. And now let me talk you through what would happen. I told you earlier about the penalty system for late submissions, which was that you get 4 points is the threshold. And then you get a charge of £200. And that if you wanted to clean the slate of penalty points, you have to have a period of compliance of 12 months, i.e. 4 returns. You need to submit 4 returns on time to wipe the slate clean. Some businesses do not submit quarterly return and instead submit monthly returns. If you submit monthly returns, well, you have a threshold of 5 points, which means that you could late submit January, February, March, April and not receive a penalty, and that's only May when you receive your first penalty for a non-submission by the deadline. The penalty is still £200 per late submission. The period of compliance here is 6 months, i.e. 6 returns need to be submitted on time. So this means that, I mean, watch out for this. If you are on monthly returns, you can start paying penalties after 5 months. It will mean you've missed 5 returns, but by May you can be paying penalties. Whereas if you're on quarterly returns, you could miss your March, you could miss your, as we've seen before, you could miss your June, you could miss your September, and you still have paid no penalties until you miss your December. So on monthly, you'd be paying penalties by May. On quarterly, you'd be paying them after December. So monthly returns, as it's always been the case, are putting themselves at risk of higher penalties because they have more to submit and therefore more opportunity for mistake. There's also annual returns, where the threshold is 2, still £200. And here you have to go 24 months to wipe the slate clean, i.e. 2 returns. Let's focus a bit more on the monthly though, because a lot of our clients who submit monthly returns, they're doing so because they are in a repayment situation where they're due money back from HMRC. Well, with repayment returns, let's do another little section down here. Old rules, no default surcharge for late submission of a repayment return. This is when HMRC owe you money. Under the new rules, treated as the same as when you owe HMRC money. What this means is that although in the current system you would not receive a penalty if you submitted a repayment return late, these businesses will fall into the same penalty point situation and could easily see themselves paying a £200 penalty for a late submission of a repayment return when they're not used to seeing penalties at all, but because HMRC owe them money, and so HMRC didn't penalise these guys in the past. That won't be the case in the future. And so this is a really important one to look out for if you're a client who is receiving repayment returns. These are the key things that I'd like you to look out for when it comes to VAT penalties. They're the things that you need to know. HMRC want you to submit on time, even if you cannot pay on time. HMRC have a penalty system which is going to penalise more when a return is outstanding for longer. But where with each new return, you're on a level footing with every other business when it comes to payment. I'd like to finish just by reminding you as well that if you are in a position where you don't think you're going to be able to pay your VAT, then it makes absolute sense to speak to HMRC before the deadline, not afterwards, because they have the option to agree a repayment plan with you. And in doing so, they have the option of avoiding these penalties for you. If you make an agreement with them, some of the penalties can be avoided. And so that's worth bearing in mind. If you're unsure whether you can pay your VAT, please do get in touch with HMRC. If you're unsure what to put on your tax returns and this is leading to late submission, please do get in contact with us and we'd be very happy to talk you through what you can do differently, how we might be able to help you to get things submitted on time. Well, this has been our presentation on, it's been a live walkthrough of VAT penalties under the old system and the new system. I hope you find it really useful.